Hello, happy Wednesday evening, everybody. Here to pick back up from where we left off last week in the reading and study of the book of Matthew. So last week we did Matthew 1 verse 2 and we finished that study and talked about, let's go back so I can see exactly who we talked about. We went up to Judah, but we started with Abraham and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and we made it all the way through to Judah. So I'm going to open my Bible app so that I can read some of these things directly as we're reading. I generally read in the NIV version. So tonight it's going to be Matthew chapter 1 verse 3 through 5. And I was going to touch on a lot of people, but there are some people who their stories were too awesome to go too deep in the other stories, because again we want to get into the meat of Matthew, but we have to get past the genealogy because it was so important to Matthew as he wrote this gospel that he started with the genealogy again to help everybody to understand who Jesus was and where he came from. And Israel was so meticulous with their census and making sure that they tracked the genealogy and ancestry. So this was really important to establish who Jesus was, and that's why Matthew started with it. And I'm going really deep into it and connecting it to the Old Testament, because it's easy when you see a list of names to just read the names and not understand why they were mentioned and why they were so important. Because if you know who these people were, you understand why it's so amazing what God has done through even the genealogy coming up to Jesus. So I'm just going to read our opening verse and then we'll go into the supporting scriptures. So Matthew 1 verse 3, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And we're going to stop there because next week we'll go into Jesse and King David, and that will be rich and deep. But today I really want to focus on Judah, Tamar, Ruth, and Boaz. And there's a character in between there whose name is Rahab. So I want to mention Rahab, but I don't want to go too deep into her backstory because that could be a whole Bible study, since there is several chapters dedicated to her. So going into Judah's story, in order to know more about who Judah was, he was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So when we talk about the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes came from Jacob, who was renamed Israel. And Judah was one of his older sons. So at the end of the last Bible study, I gave you all of the names of those 12 brothers. So we're going to go into this scripture starting with Genesis 37, and we're going to actually start this story with Joseph, Judah's youngest brother. So if you recall the last Bible study, I'm trying to get to my Bible app. If you recall the last Bible study, we were talking about Jacob and how his uncle Laban tricked him into marrying both of his daughters. He wanted to marry Rachel, so he worked for 7 years, and then he ended up being tricked into marrying Leah because she was the older daughter, and Laban said that she should be married first. And then after he agreed to work another 7 years to marry Rachel, who was the woman he wanted to marry. And that is kind of where we left off, was with Rachel and Leah and Jacob. And through them, the 12 sons of Israel were born. So we're going to go to Genesis 27. It's a little bit past all of that. I think 37, not 27. And it's a little bit past all of that happening. It's actually quite a bit past all of that happening. And it starts with Joseph's dreams. So if you've ever heard of Joseph and the multicolored coat, or the many-colored coat, or the King of Dreams, this is where this comes from. Joseph was Jacob's second youngest son. Second youngest. Benjamin was the youngest. And they both came through Rachel, who was the woman he loved. And they say, it says in the scriptures, let's just read it, starting with verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. So this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, and you'll notice that it kind of goes back and forth between calling him Jacob and Israel, and there's many theories about why, that perhaps when he's called Jacob, it's because he's not acting in the character of who God called him to be. And when they call him Israel, it's because he's acting in line with what that name means, the prophecy that is carried in his name as being the nation of Israel. So that was one very interesting theory, which when you read it, kind of makes sense when you read the context of what he's doing and what's happening around him when he's called Jacob, and what he's doing and what's happening when he's called Israel. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now we're on verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than them, they hated him, could not speak a kind word to him. 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And so there was obviously like a lot of high tension between Joseph and his brothers. So now we're going to go to the part later on, which if you know the story, you know what's coming up next. Joseph, because of the coat, his coat represented a position of authority over his brothers. And he was supposed to monitor whether his brothers, in the beginning of the story, you'll see he was tending the flock with his brothers. But later you'll see that his brothers go to tend the flock, and he is supposed to check in and bring a report to his father of what they're doing. So now not only is he talking about this dream that he's had, not only is he the favorite of his father, but now he's been put in a position to, in essence, watch them and report what they're doing or what they're not doing back to their father, which only increases their hatred toward their younger brother, who at this time might have been the youngest. I think Benjamin has been born, actually. So we're getting to the place where Joseph is going to see what his brothers are doing. And as they see him coming, at verse 17, they had moved on from here, a man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come, now let us kill and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." And so when Joseph came, they took him and they threw him into the cistern. They took his robe and they threw him in the cistern, which was empty because there was no water in it. So we're also getting an idea, because a cistern is where you hold water. So if this cistern that Joseph was thrown into was empty, it means that they haven't had water or rainfall in a while. So they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up. They saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So Judah's idea was, instead of killing Joseph, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites who are coming up and they're heading to Egypt. So the merchants came by, and you'll notice in verse 28, it calls them the Midianite merchants. And this again, it says, the Midianite merchants came by. His brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. And again, that's one of those things where you see two different names being used. The Midianite merchants at the beginning of the verse, and the Ishmaelites at the end of the verse. And again, in the last verse, they were called the Ishmaelites. And again, this is one of those things that people think is a contradictory thing, but Ishmaelites is in mentioning the tribe that they came from. These were people who came from Ishmael, who was the firstborn son of Abraham, but he wasn't the son of the promise, and he actually did grow to become a very powerful nation. The Ishmaelites came from his line, but Midianites refers to a location. Midian is a place. And so when it says Ishmaelites at the beginning of the verse, but Midianites later, it is an interchangeable term. In essence, they were Ishmaelites from Midian. So just to clear up any confusion that could be perceived there. So they sold him to the Midianites, and then they tore his robe and dipped it in blood of a goat. And they took the robe to their father, and they told their father that they found his robe. He must have been torn to pieces by an animal. And Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned his son for many days. And he refused to be comforted. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And I'm not going to read all of Joseph's story, because the focus tonight is on Judah. But there's just a little bit of background. Is that Judah was one of the older sons. But again, when we see the people who, God used, God spoke to, or that God brought his promises through, again, Jesus came from Judah's bloodline. You see that he didn't choose perfect people, and even being people of the promise, they continued to show serious issues with humanity: anger, wrath, hatred, murder, attempted murder, selling your brother into slavery, these kinds of things that are quite questionable in the case of morality. But moving forward from there, we're going to continue to read about Judah. The reason I started with that is because in order to understand a lot of the stuff coming forward, for instance, we know that the Israelites came out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. Well, how did they end up in Egypt? When they sold their brother to the Midianites, he became a slave in the house of Potiphar. He served Potiphar, who was an official for Pharaoh. He was everything he touched prospered, and people trusted him with whatever. So wherever he served, it went well, and people would push him to higher and higher positions of authority, so to speak, but he was still a slave. But he would be the one who was over things and watching over things because he was well trusted and everything he did was successful. So while obviously being sold into slavery was not a good thing, and certainly not something anyone would ever want, or how someone should treat their brother, family member, or even a stranger, he did well until Potiphar's wife decided that she wanted to sleep with him, and he refused to sleep with her. And so she reported that he had tried to sleep with her, and he ended up in prison. And even in prison, he was highly favored and ended up in positions of kind of authority, even under the guard. And in the prison, a baker and a wine bearer, the cupbearer and the baker for the Pharaoh, were there, and they both had a dream. And without going into all of the details, Joseph was able to interpret their dreams correctly, and one of them was restored to his position, and one of them was hanged as he had interpreted in the dream. Moving forward, the Pharaoh has a lot of I think it was 2 or 3 troubling dreams, 2 dreams. And the dreams were about a coming famine, but he didn't know what it meant. He just knew that it was very disturbing dreams. And he knew that they were divine, but he couldn't interpret them. And so he reached out for everybody in his land, the wise people, the psychics, the sorcerers, everybody to come and interpret this dream, and nobody could. And at that time, I believe it was the cupbearer who was, here it is, in Genesis 40, you can read that about the cupbearer and the baker. So, yes, the cupbearer was the one who was put back into his position, and the baker was killed. And so the cupbearer remembers that Joseph interpreted his dream in prison. And so he tells the Pharaoh, there's this Hebrew slave in the prison who interpreted this dream for me, and everything that he said happened as he said. Since no one else can interpret these dreams, and I know that this person was speaking from the Lord, have him listen to the dream and interpret it. And so the Pharaoh sent for Joseph and had him washed and put in clean clothes and presented to the Pharaoh, who told him the dream. And as soon as he heard the dream, he interpreted it correctly. And the interpretation was that there was a severe famine coming, and that they would have, I don't want to misinterpret the dream. There would be, because I want to get the number of years right. There would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine would be so severe that nobody would even remember the 7 years of plenty. And so after Joseph interpreted the dream, Pharaoh asked, what should we do? And Joseph said that basically they should have everybody, they would set up essentially silos and store 1/5 of all of the harvest for 7 years. And then when the famine came, they would have stored that food and they would sell it back to everybody so that everybody would have plenty to eat and everyone would continue to be prosperous in Egypt. And when the famine came, when Pharaoh heard the plan, he put Joseph in charge of overseeing everything. And so he became second in command under Pharaoh over the nation of Egypt. which, again, we see at this time, which was 13 years after he had the dream. I believe he was 30 years old when this happened. We see the fulfillment of the dream that he had when he was 17. He is now in a position of authority over the nation of Egypt. And when the famine hits, it hits everywhere. And so his family living in Canaan still, they have no food. And so they hear that there is plenty of food in Egypt, that they just have to travel there and buy food from the new commander, the chief in command. And so they go to get food, and they don't even recognize that the chief in command is their brother Joseph. And they bow to him, and they're afraid of him. And eventually he reveals himself as their brother, and he has them move with him to Egypt because he's now very successful. He is able to provide all of their needs, and he is able to save his family from starvation. So that is where we are going to pick up. This is how the Israelites ended up in Egypt. But over time, they continued to live in Egypt, and they continued to multiply. Again, we have 12 tribes here. So eventually, everybody in Joseph's family died, and there were new generations and new generations and new generations. And when the people became too many, they were under a new Pharaoh, and he enslaved the people and began trying to keep them from continuing to multiply by killing all of the male children, which is where Moses comes in 400 years later. So that is how the Israelites ended up in Egypt. But before we got there, before they multiplied and all of the brothers died, we're going to go into Judah's story, which picks up again in Genesis 38. And actually, this was before all of that, but that's just some reference. Going back, we were in Genesis 44 with all of that, but we're going to go back to 38 because this is the story about Judah and Tamar. So Judah left his brothers and went to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. This is Genesis 38:1. There, Judah met a daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth still to another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But his firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. So Tamar's first husband, Judah's oldest son, died. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." And as a part of Mosaic law, if a woman became a widow and he had a brother or someone who could step in and continue his family's line, they would raise up children for the brother. So Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep. And his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and she sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been a shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he didn't sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But then he withdrew his hand, and his brother came out. And she said, "This is how you have broken out." And his name was Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and his name was Zerah. And you should probably recognize these names from Matthew 1, verses 3 through 5. When we read that earlier, these were the sons of Judah, through whom the Messiah was born. So that's why they are mentioned in the genealogy. And that's how they came about. And going into another story now, we're going to talk about Ruth and Boaz, because understanding their story and what a kinsman redeemer is will make more sense of Judah and Tamar's story. And as it always is, it also gives understanding to who Jesus was. And everything in the law was foreshadowing the coming of Christ and what he represented. And so going into the book of Ruth, that will make a lot of sense here in a minute. So Ruth, verse 1, this is, so Ruth, sorry, I'm trying to remember. So this is going to come back because they're all through the bloodline of Judah. After this story, Boaz comes through the bloodline of Judah, and that will be explained as well through another story. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So they went to Moab from Bethlehem in Judah. Now Elimelech in Judah is now so far back that it's a place and a group of a tribe. It's not even just a person anymore. We read his story. Now we're talking about the tribe of Judah, the people who have come from generations. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So now Naomi is a widow, and she doesn't have any sons, And again, in the time, it was the sons who would care for the mother in her old age. And because she now had no husband, there was no one to cover her or protect her or provide for her. So there was no one for her husband's wealth, to continue through. There was nothing. She was left with nothing. So moving on to verse 6, Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, so the famine is over. She and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, so she's leaving Moab and she's going back to Bethlehem in Judah. But she's taking her daughters-in-law, who were married to her sons who died, and along the way, she turns back to them and she tells them to go back home, go back to Moab, go back to your people, go back to your gods. I have nothing left to give you. And Orpah turns back and goes back to Moab, but Ruth says that, let's see. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you," verse 16, "or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to urge her to go back. And then Ruth 2, we're in chapter 2 now, Ruth meets Boaz in the grain field. So now that Ruth and Naomi are both widows, they go back to Naomi's hometown, and everyone is happy to see her, but they're sad because she left with a husband and she had 2 sons and she came back with nothing, and she went back to the land that she and her husband had. And one of the things that the widows would do is they would go and glean in the fields of the people who owned like grain fields or whatever the harvest was, barley. And so they would go, and the people who were working would work the harvest, and the women would go and pick up whatever they could and take it back home to provide for their families. So at this time, Naomi tells Ruth to go out and glean in the fields, and she goes and she finds a field owned by a man named Boaz. Now, she didn't know Boaz, and Naomi didn't know which field she was going into, so this is an example of like a divine setup, for lack of a better terminology. So it says that she went out in the fields, and we're starting at verse 4. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvest, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite woman who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and wherever you are thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." At this, she bowed down her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And so he takes her and feeds her a meal and gives her food to take back home. And then he tells his harvesters that when they're gathering, to purposefully drop some of the heads of grains or barley. Is it barley or grain? Grain. It's barley later. to purposefully drop some heads of grain for her so that she can gather more than she would if they were harvesting as hard as they usually would. So she goes back home to Naomi, and she has the food that he provided for her from the meal, and she has a whole basket of grain. And Naomi asks her, "Where did you get all this?" And going to verse 19, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." And Ruth said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It'll be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So now we have Ruth 3. We're going to Ruth and Boaz at the threshing floor. So threshing is something you do with grain or barley or wheat, and you thresh it. It's an act of trying to separate the wheat or the heads of grain from the chaff, and chaff is like the useless stuff. And usually when they'll thresh, the wind will blow away the chaff, and what's left, as after they beat the grain, what's left is the good grain, because it's heavy and it falls to the ground when the chaff blows away. So this is what Boaz is doing. He's at the threshing floor, and Naomi tells Ruth, because she knows that Boaz is going to be in the threshing room by himself threshing the grain. She tells Ruth that Boaz is something called a kinsman redeemer for her family. So he's one of her closest relatives. And she tells her to do something that sounds very strange. She tells her to wait until Boaz has eaten and drank and he's in good spirits when he lays down and goes to sleep, to go uncover his feet and then lay near his feet. And when he wakes up, she's supposed to basically ask him to cover her. And he would have understood that to mean that she was asking him to marry her and to cover her family. And so that is what she does. And so going for we're going to start with verse 9. He wakes up in the middle of the night and he sees the woman at his feet, and he doesn't recognize who she is because it's dark. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "The kindness is greater than what you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, rich or poor. Now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you're a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am a guardian redeemer of your family, there's another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." And so she does, and then he gives her some grain in the morning and sends her home, and he goes straight out to find the other person who is closer of kin and has more legal right to redeem Ruth and, in essence, Naomi and her family. So they took 10 elders of the town, so it was a legal proceeding. They had to have witnesses, and it says here in chapter 4, verse 3, he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you do not, tell me so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, the other man said. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said that I cannot redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. And so again, this was the expectation, was that if the person, the next of kin or family relative, would redeem it. So basically, to redeem, because as you saw in verse starting, Naomi has come back in verse 3. She's selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative. So basically, Naomi has nothing. In order to survive, she would have to sell her husband's land. So she is asking a family member to buy it and continue his line so that she doesn't have to go into servitude in order to care for herself. She's basically asking for them to step in as the man of their family to produce an heir and to continue their estate and to keep them from having to go into homelessness, essentially, or servitude. So that is what it means to be the guardian redeemer. So the other one who had the higher claim didn't want to redeem it because he already had a son who would inherit his estate. And if he were to marry Ruth and have another son, he would have to split everything, and he wasn't willing to do that. But Boaz was. So Boaz married Ruth, and he redeemed the family. And the reason that was so important is because in this way he showed, again, very metaphorically, what Jesus is for us, is our Redeemer. When someone can't pay a debt, especially in the Old Testament, it was very common for the person to give themselves into servitude until they could pay back everything with their work. So essentially, if you couldn't pay back a debt, you would sell yourself for up to 7 years until the debt was paid in full. In essence, someone else could step in and purchase your debt and free you or redeem you from that. And essentially, in a way, that's what happened, or what is seen in the story of Boaz and Ruth, the kinsman redeemer. In our situation, our debt is because we're actually born into our debt because it's generational. Our debt is to sin. And so essentially we cannot pay to set ourselves free from sin. We cannot pay to set ourselves free from the one we're serving. And we, in our lives, whether consciously or unconsciously, as the scripture says, you cannot serve two masters, because you'll hate one and love the other, or you'll despise one and you will, I can't remember the other part of that. But it's talking about, it says you cannot serve God and mammon, which is worldly wealth. But we also understand that when we are slaves to sin, we know that the wages of sin is death. And so essentially, because of the debt that we owe, the cost of our sin is death. And in eternal terminology, death is eternal separation from God. And God is every good thing, right? I mean, I have this weird thing when Cody and I talk about like what's your favorite thing to do, I say breathe. I love breathing. It's great. I mean, if you think that's weird, try holding your breath for a full minute and see if you don't like breathing too. Breathing is great. And the scripture talks about how God is the breath of life. He breathed his breath into man and made man a living soul. And the absence of God would be the absence of breath. I've heard people who have, if you read some of the stories of people who have had, I don't even want to say near-death experiences, people who have been clinically dead and experienced hell, one of the things that you'll see is they talk about how they couldn't get a breath, like they were struggling to breathe. Every time they tried to inhale, they felt like they were suffocating, but it never ended. They didn't wake up. They didn't die because they're already dead, and their eternal body cannot die. So they continue to be in this state of gasping for air that isn't there, because air comes from the presence of God. Oxygen, like all of the things we need to live, it comes from God. God is light. Hell is dark. Besides the fiery part, and not all of hell is fire. If you read the scriptures, it describes several different things that are in hell. But it is dark because Jesus is the light. And the absence of God, there is darkness. There is no light. There is no air. There is no peace. There is no joy. There is no rest. You can't go to sleep. There is no rest. God is rest. He's our Prince of Peace, and he gives us rest. And like all of these things. And so when we talk about hell, that's our automatic destination when we get to an age of being held accountable, an age of accountability, when you get to a place where morally you can make a decision about the things that you're doing, and you can have understanding, and especially once you have access, like you have the knowledge, you've heard the truth, and you've made a decision, you're making choices. But that the point of a redeemer is that when you can't pay the debt, the redeemer will step in and purchase your debt. And that's exactly what Jesus did when he died for us. He stepped in as our redeemer. We owe a debt that leads to eternal death and separation from God. We don't get to be in the presence of God in the state that we are in. But because of what Jesus did, we can. Because of what Jesus did, when we die, we can have eternal life instead of death, because we accepted the gift that he died to give us. He didn't just die to take away our sin in a sense that like that's it kind of way. He died and he gave us in return, he paid the price for our sin so that we could redeem life. Eternal life, relationship with God, communion with God, fellowship with God. We can live in a way that is pleasing to God. We can be renewed and walk with him, be sanctified, and it's a process. But all of that comes by first accepting what he did, because it is a decision, it's a transaction. If you want to think about it in that way, is he offers it, he did it, once and for all. It was enough to cover everybody, but you have to decide, hey, you have to ask him. Just like Ruth went to Boaz, she had a need, she recognized the need, and she uncovered his feet, and she waited for him and asked him to cover her. She recognized her need, and she requested what she needed from the person who could provide it. And in the same way, we have a need, we have a debt that we can't pay, but it's already been paid in full. We just have to go to the person who can afford it, and there's only one, and allow him to cover everything that we can't. And I believe that when we talk about how God is love, that's one of the reasons, if you read in the scriptures, it talks about how love covers a multitude of sins. He covers all of that because of his love, because he loves us. He covers it. He doesn't expose us. He doesn't shame us. He covers. And he's covering the cost. He's covering the guilt. He's covering the shame. He's covering everything. And we can walk in the fullness of what he's offering in return. And when I first did the research, this wasn't the message I was planning on doing. And I completely didn't get to Rahab, and I do want to end this in a timely manner. But Rahab was important because through her, she was a prostitute in Jericho. And she protected the Israelite spies when they came to take the land of Jericho. And in exchange for protecting them, they protected her and took her in, and she married Salmon, I do believe. I'm not 100% on that. I can't even find my notes. I've got so many screens open. You have to forgive me. But I want to just really quickly. So Rahab married Salmon, and through Rahab came Boaz. I say hesitantly. Yes. So she was also in the genealogy and the bloodline of the Messiah who came through this family line. You can find more about Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 through 25. That's where you'll see the story of how she protected the spies. And then if you want to go on and see how the story concluded, it's Joshua 6, 1 through 25. That goes into her relationship with Salmon and her bloodline. I'm trying to find it. Joshua 6, 1 through 25, and then I'm done, I promise. Okay, I'm just going to type it because it's too hard to scroll through quickly. Joshua 6, 1 through 25, and you see, let's just go through to 25, because that's probably where, no. That is where they took over. Does it mention Salmon? Or is actually, that's where you see where he protected, they pulled aside Rahab and they spared her when they took the land of Jericho. So where did I write down? I believe it was in, I have so many scriptures. 1 Chronicles 2. That's where you can see Chronicles, Numbers, are really good books to see more about genealogy and see all of these stories and where they were interrelated. But the reason I wanted to mention this part is just so you see the connection. Here we are. Ram was the father, 1 Chronicles 2:10. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon, the leader of the people of Judah. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. So Rahab and Salmon had Boaz. And we just read the story of Ruth and Boaz. And Boaz and Ruth had Obed. And Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. So all super connected. So important when we see those list of names, not to just ignore so many details, so many important things, so many reasons those stories are included. However, I will say, while I want to give justice to Matthew and go into the background and the genealogy, I'm really eager to get into these parables and the meat of the story. So thank you for watching. I hope it was educational, enjoyable, and hope you learned something new. I certainly have, going this deep into Bible study. And catch you next week. And we are getting close to the end of the genealogy, and we'll be getting into the story. Thank you so much. God bless you, and have a good night.